Welcome back to our catechesis series, Our Anglican Heritage. We're walking through a few videos on the subject of the early modern period, looking at some of the immediate aftermath of the English Reformation. So last time we looked at James I and the King James Bible. And today we'll look at what happens to the English Church under Charles I and during the Protectorate. So Charles I. Charles, son of James I, succeeds his father to the throne. And like his father, but even more so, Charles has this intense belief in what's called the divine right of kings. So the king derives his authority from God alone and therefore is accountable to God alone. So to that end, Charles dissolves Parliament and governs by himself, and regarded himself above the law, which was not something that was very popular in England, given that kings were subject to the Magna Carta for many, many centuries by this point and had a long tradition of sharing power with Parliament. One of Charles's biggest supporters was none other than the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. And Laud is an interesting archbishop, known for being an outspoken Arminian and a promoter of high church Anglicanism. So for one thing, he demanded that the 39 articles be interpreted according to Arminian, that is, anti-Calvinist beliefs. So up until this point, most Anglicans interpreted the 39 articles more or less in line with a lot of John Calvin's Reformed theology. But around this time period, led by folks like William Laud, there will be a push to instead interpret the articles in more of an Arminian or anti-Calvinist direction. And of course, that will upset our Presbyterians and Puritans in the Church of England at this time. Likewise, these groups will also be upset that William Laud was keen to emphasize ceremony and ritual in the church. So for instance, he required kneeling at the Eucharist. He installed communion rails for that purpose. And the more Puritan-minded folks in the Church of England could not handle this. And so Laud hoped to preserve church unity through a strict uniformity and a rigid enforcement of the law. So similar to Charles's objectives in that regard. And as we see, this will hasten the desire for revolution. The English Civil War actually is touched off when Charles has the not particularly bright idea to bring the Scottish Church in line and impose a prayer book on Scotland. So up to this point, Scotland, thanks to the influence of John Knox in particular, was a Presbyterian church. But in uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, James and then Charles sought to unite the churches as well. And so Charles wants to make the Scottish church more like the English church. The Scots pull a William Wallace and revolt, forcing Charles to call Parliament, finally. Charles quickly dissolves it. This is the so-called short Parliament. But when the war goes very poorly, Charles is forced to recall Parliament. And now Parliament refuses to be dissolved, the so-called Long Parliament. So Parliament at this point has had it with Charles and is going to be much more outspoken in its demands. And very important as they affected the English church. So for one thing, Parliament sends Charles the Root and Branch petition, which demanded an end to the episcopacy. So they wanted to get rid of the whole system of bishops and instead have a Presbyterian model of government. Parliament also had Archbishop Laud impeached and jailed, pretty serious move. And they present a series of demands to Charles calling for further political and religious reform. So things begin spiraling out of control. And starting in 1642, we have what's called the First English Civil War. And on the one hand, we have the king and the Anglican Church pitted against, on the other hand, Parliament and the Puritans. So this is a political conflict, but it's also a religious conflict, a social conflict. A lot of things are caught up in the English Civil War. But focusing on the religious elements, once the Civil War begins and the king has fled, Parliament moves ahead and abolishes the episcopacy and instead sets up a Presbyterian form of government over the Church of England. At which point the Book of Common Prayer was declared illegal. So that BCP you have sitting on your shelf at home was once a contraband book in England. It was replaced by the Presbyterian Directory of Public Worship, which provided a broad outline for what a Presbyterian service looked like, much less liturgical than an Anglican service, wanting a lot more room for free and extemporaneous prayer. Now, not all of members of Parliament and those who were Puritans, not all of them supported Presbyterianism. Rather, some of them, so-called independents, wanted more of a pure congregational model, where perhaps there was no established church at all. And one of the most famous of these independents was Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of Parliament's armies, and as we'll see, will become a very important figure shortly. Also, Parliament has Archbishop Laud beheaded, so sad for him. Parliament wins the Civil War and has Charles imprisoned. This story gets very convoluted. Charles actually escapes for a while. There's a second English Civil War. Charles actually tries negotiating a secret treaty with the Scots. He says, hey, if you'll invade England and bail me out, I'll establish Presbyterianism as the form of the church here in England. But this potential Scottish invasion is stopped by Cromwell. And so what are we going to do with Charles if we're Parliament? Well, a lot of Parliament still supports Charles's claim to the monarchy. The idea of somehow getting rid of the king was crazy talk to many in Parliament, even those who were frustrated with Charles. But Cromwell has a much more radical idea. Remember, he's on the side of the independents. And so Cromwell uses the power of the army to purge Parliament of anyone who is in favor of bringing Charles back into power, creating what's sometimes called the Rump Parliament. And then taking the step that would perhaps doom him by horrifying much of England and much of the continent, Cromwell has Charles executed on January 30th, 1649. In the chaos that followed Charles' execution, Cromwell seized power as so-called Lord Protector of England. So this is the culmination of what's sometimes called the Puritan Revolution. This period is also known as the Protectorate, the Commonwealth. It's all the same thing. And during this time period, Presbyterianism replaced Anglicanism as the official church of England. You didn't have to be Presbyterian. You could not be Catholic. You could not be Anglican. Both of those forms of Christianity were outlawed during the Protectorate. But besides Presbyterian, you could be Congregationalist, Baptist, Quaker, or some of these other new sects that were emerging in the early 1600s. And here we have a much more severe Calvinist, austere, Puritan form of Christianity in control. So for instance, Christmas was forbidden to be celebrated. After all, Christmas isn't in the Bible. It's not on a Sunday. And so there's some stories of people who braved being jailed to attend a Christmas service in London. Strict enforcement of Sabbath laws, things like that. Those Anglican clergy who refused to conform to the new way of doing things worked behind the scenes to secretly plan for when the monarchy and episcopacy would be, hopefully they hoped, restored. And in fact, they advised the future Charles II, ensuring he would stay Anglican, as opposed to converting to some other form of faith while he was in exile. So that's where we'll leave the historical narrative for this time. But it's worth mentioning a group known as the Caroline Divines. So Charles, Caroline, same word. So these are some of the very important Anglican theologians and figures during the reign of Charles I and then Charles II as well. So collectively, the Caroline Divines. These Caroline Divines pursued, in the tradition of Richard Hooker, a via media between, on the one hand, Roman Catholicism, and on the other hand, John Calvin's program of Reformed theology. That in some would seek to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness by going back to the early church. So whereas the Catholic Church, they believed, had been corrupted by a lot of medieval additions, and whereas the other Protestant reformers had done away with the early traditions of the first centuries, the Caroline Divines instead hoped to recreate the church of the early centuries. So some of the key figures that you should at least have heard of their names: Lancelot Andrewes is very important in the King James Bible, best known for his book of private prayers, perhaps. The poet George Herbert, a lot of his poems still very popular even today. Nicholas Ferrar is perhaps the most interesting to me. He and his family and some of his extended family created a semi-monastic community on a farm in a place called Little Gidding, and so tried to organize their family life kind of around the routines of the monastery. So we can talk more about him in a future catechesis, perhaps. Also Jeremy Taylor, who wrote a practical handbook for how the laity could approach the Christian life. And finally, John Cozen, who was a liturgical expert, helped pave the way for the next Book of Common Prayer. So again, these are the Caroline Divines. All right, so on Zoom, perhaps we can talk about why is this difference between Anglicanism and Puritanism so important? Even today, what distinguishes Anglicanism from those forms of Protestantism that have their roots in Puritanism? So look forward to talking with you then.